Hello everyone, today we talk about the alleged Tertullian's anti-militarism, right? The transformation, the change of Tertullian's thinking about the Christian exercise of arms and the broader allegiance to the state, to imperial authorities. This is an important topic that we introduced here and there. We talked about St. Paul and the Militia Christi. We talked about the creation of a true Roman Christian consciousness from the thought of Ambrose of Milan. Today we talk about this time is essentially the 3rd century. It's this moment in which the empire still, at the beginning of the 3rd century, which the empire is still functional, right? It's still standing before the crisis of the mid-century, and Christianity is spreading, and Christians are essentially still persecuted in part. Not always wasn't a constant situation. On the contrary, Christians normally participated to all branches of society at this time, mostly in the lower, in part also in middle classes. It's mostly only from Constantinian times that they get to the upper levels, but they have already acquired, in fact, an important level of education, and there is this debate going on within the Christian community, but also with pagan authors, about what is becoming essentially the new normal, that is, the habitual and important in terms of mass presence of Christians in society. And Tertullian is, here we would need a huge introduction that I skip, because I believe it's fundamentally notorious. What were the intrinsic problems of Christianity towards the exercise of violence, the debate that took place since the very early times regarding the issue. But today we mostly take a look at Tertullian, because it's one of those authors that is often quoted as here's the proof that fundamentally the Christians were anti-militarists. They were pacifists. They didn't want to fight. It was forbidden, and that's pretty much it. Technically, as we will see, this statement should be very much contextualized, because Tertullian had a bit of a different thought after all, and still even the most extremistic and definitely and apparently, say, anti-militaristic statements must be very much contextualized and put in perspective. We'll see also what Origen basically said to that from the other side, that actually is even more pacific in its message compared to Tertullian at a certain point, but for that very reason it actually starts to put enough ground to develop this essentially Christian participation, at least to the wealth, to the power, also military one of the empire broadly meant. And this is fundamental also to understand. Here we're talking just about authors that eventually became very famous because they're part of the early Christian literature. They're very important, very studied. But this is a time in which Christians, as we were saying before, normally participate to the army. Right? There's never been a moment in which Christians were not there, that actually cared excessively much even about these prescriptions. Here, once again, we do not need to digress in the fact that also, whatever their beliefs really were in terms of actual adherence to the Christian message, there was a lot of commixtions of values, of beliefs, and so it was really nothing strange of having, Christians in the army are participating as all the other soldiers, fundamentally in the same ways. There are, however, examples of resistance to certain, impositions that were issued in the army for political reasons at a certain given moment. Today we'll look especially at the times of Septimius Severus, that will are very important context and key for reading Tertullian's extremization of thought towards participation to the army for Christians, and that, however, are the obvious demonstration that, of course, Christians were otherwise habitually in the army and accepting even the oath of the emperor, of course, bloodshed, because that's what soldiers are exclusively conceived to do in every single historical age. I mean, there is not another way of thinking that. and maybe we're fooling ourselves that today things have changed. This is not changed at all, right? And it is actually a positive thing. Like, the message that we try to give here is, I don't know whether you consider it too subjective, but I take a specific stand also within the position here that the various Christian authors expressed relatively to the what the Christian society of those times had to be and what it would become. Tertullian's words are actually very influenced, as we'll see, also by Montanism. That was a very ascetic and let aside it would become an heretical movement, actually recognized as such at Chalcedon in 381. But it's fundamentally an anti-elite movement, right? It's very much against the secular elite, and especially the same bishops that were trying at this point actually to find important connections with Roman society as a whole, right? Even if technically the Christians were still marginalized. And the idea is that, of course, there are certain, in every ideology, or in any, let's say, community, there are certain extremistic stands that are, however, mostly the ones that echo the most, that shout the most, while the average is actually much more moderate and actually sees with a rational approach that is also capable of compromise. That's what civilization is made up of with the current reality, and fundamentally, as we know, that's what Christianity fundamentally would take. Too often, and that's why I say I skip an enormous amount of intro here, because otherwise we would never end the video. But the point is that we mostly, popular culture, discuss the rise of Christianity or whatever, also the reaction to it in extremistic terms, right? This was good or evil, or right or wrong, right? At universities, we do not make history like this. It doesn't work like that. Nobody cares, literally, right? There is no intellectual pride in framing dialectically the historical problems in those terms, right? Professionals do not do it, scholars do not do it, and even those who do are, generally speaking, considered scarce, to say the least. But really, at this point, it's just ridiculous. Maybe some, an isolated, heavy ideologized private university can't maybe feed people with that, and that's also a problem, in fact. But worldwide, the standard's pretty damn clear about this. So let's come to Tertullian specifically, because the point is actually very interesting on its own, especially this transition of his thought, and it's self-explanatory in that way more than any premise I can make. So Tertullian, as we've seen, is often taken as the example of Christian anti-militarism, and it will be important to remember that with him we find in front of an author that in this relatively short time, this roughly 15 years, he accomplishes this deep change from complexively moderate apologetical standpoints will lead him to the Montanistic extremism. Right? And it falls into this, still into the apologetical tradition, the discourse carried out in the Apologeticum, or Apologeticum at that time, a title that renders almost tautological our observation. So the efforts of the author are concentrated here into demonstrating that a Christian could, without any contradiction, absolve his duties towards the empire and at the same time to remain a reprehensible member of the church. And Tertullian insists on the massive Christian presence at this point in all the branches of society and on the positive commitment of such community, and among the other branches also in the army. And next to the positive commitment, here it's the indefectible loyalty of the Christians towards the emperor and the usefulness of their prayers for him. because they invoke on their leader a long life, a secure reign, a tranquil house, strong armies, a faithful senate, uh, principled, honest people, and a quiet world. Right? So, as we've seen, also strong armies, right? And the ones of which the same Christians are part of. And when these things were written, right, beginning of the 3rd century, it was still alive, the echo of events such as the one for which the Christian propaganda wanted protagonist, the 12th Legion, the Legio Fulminata, the Thunder Bearer. This event during the Marcomannic Wars, when the Roman legions in Bohemia are cut off from the enemies, and they do not have enough water. So there is this miraculous rain that fundamentally makes them surpass this impasse. And both pagans and Christians tend to say, that was our own God who did that, which already by itself obviously demonstrates that Christians were absolutely fine with the fact that the Roman Empire would go well in that sense, and its armies too. So, specifically, in fact, the affair of the miraculous rain constitutes by itself a meaningful example of apologetic technique in this regard. And at the time was especially alive the Celsian controversy on the role of the Christians in the empire that was open as a consequence of the repressive measures that were adopted by Marcus Aurelius that actually persecuted the Christians, and therefore the necessity to defend the Christians themselves of the same emperor's accusations of antisocial behavior, of anti-Semitism. So Christians by that time were actually largely saying, we are integrating part of the empire. We're everywhere. We work for the empire. We're fine with it, after all. But, however, those Christians that, according to Tertullian, filled the military encampments didn't have to be all equally sensitized, let's say, nor reacting in the same way in front of the problem of the agreement between the Militia Dei and the Militia Seculi. In 202-203 AD, in Africa, the soldier Basilis was martyrized, right? And he had specifically refused to present to the emperor an oath that he had essentially felt as contrary to his own fate. And at the beginning of the 3rd century, in the austere atmosphere imposed by Septimius Severus to the empire, from that hieratic atmosphere spread from the same sovereign around his authority, episodes like that of Basilis were really serious and revealed at least a ongoing incompatibility at some level, destined at that point not to be resolved between naturally the empire and the church, unless one of the two sides had not given up. So from here, the evident sclerotization in depth of the fundamental stiffening of the respective position. From one side, imperial one was more needed for the pretended observance of the juridical ritual forms with which the loyalty to the state was sanctioned. From the Christian side, hardening, entrenching in the refusal to accomplish, to carry out gestures that entailed yielding in front of idolatry. From this renewed tension stems Tertullian's De Corona. This is our work that was written around 211, according at least the majority of scholars. A more recent study actually anticipated it to 208 circa, but whatever. And the intransigence showed in this work towards military service, so in contrast to the conciliatory efforts, and on the contrary, the collaborationistic claims of the Apologeticum, is orderly imputed to Tertullian's passage to Montanism, through which we could conclude simplistically that the anti-militaristic visions of this kind belong to Montanism rather than reflecting a more general tendency in the Christian world, and conversely that the anti-militaristic prejudices present in the first Christianity would be of Montanist origin. In reality, we have to be very cautious to even just think in these terms, because more than to the conviction of his author, or together with them, the De Corona actually resents of the disciplinary atmosphere in the army that had changed after the Severian directions and the issues that were more exigent requests of formal deference to the statal sacrality, and therefore the correspondent radicalization of the Christian resistance. You know that this was the main deal, right? The Christians were not to sacrifice to the emperor, and that was the main problem that actually most Christians simply bypassed. We know it by fact. You know, most of them simply said they don't care. There was actually a current within Saint Christianity that said, you know, if you really have to, you know, if the consequence is you getting killed, right, just sacrifice, then you will expiate for that. Then there were much more rigoristic currents that are also the ones that for ideological propagandistic reason, especially after Constantinian times, were, you know, in a sense historically, let's say, expanded to this previous era by pretending to show that Christians had just been, you know, let themselves being martyrized all the time. This is actually not true, right? Actually, the same Constantinian propaganda doesn't go that far. But as we have seen here, the picture was much more actually tranquil than it's really mostly believed, right? Persecutions were somewhat rare, especially in its most violent outcomes, and really there wasn't even a real standardization in the empire. Is every province fundamentally, you know, the empire issued something, but then at a local level there was a wide choice. The Roman authorities were quite tolerant. It's not that they cared particularly much to get rid of the Christians. The masses actually were much more superstitious in this regard, looked at the Christians for everything wrong that happened, because they said these are the ones that do not sacrifice. So, but, you know, at a more rational level, from as the elites, as government mostly is, it was understood that it wasn't even this enormous deal. But still, in those times, it mattered a lot for many reasons. They're not just ideological, but are of precise, also functional, you know, consequence. And as it's clear, especially in the army, right, it was a formal problem that, however, aside from the profound value that surely the form had in all pre-modern civilizations, as we've seen, became a disciplinary problem, and therefore a problem of serious substance in an army, where discipline is what holds the whole thing together. So in this sense, Tertullian's attitude, even if this was a consequence of his sectarian convictions at the time, essentially met at that point with a more general position of the Christians within the army than had seen a considerable worsening of their condition, because they were cornered in a way that in previous times wasn't. And the events that provided for inspiration to the De Corona are famous. In Lambesis, close to Carthage, a soldier of the 3rd Legion had refused to wear a crown to receive the donativum that had been granted in occasion of the festivity for the succession of Geta and Caracalla to the throne, still held by Septimius Severus. Tertullian, in warmly approving that soldier's behavior, also counterposes his coherence to the spirit of adaptation of too many others, and underlines the duty of every Christian to subtract themselves from idolatric acts, such as the saint wearing that crown, but eventually passing to the restricted problem of the acts of idolatry, about which he is definitely intransigent, to the wider one of the compatibility between the profession of Christianity and the military condition. The ardent polemist becomes much more friendly. There are, however, many reasons that remain for which military service is, according to Tertullian, inconvenient for Christians, right? And especially the difficulty in remaining faithful contemporarily to a sacramentum given to God, offered to God, and one especially to man instead. But also, naturally, the contraposition between the use of arms and faith in a word of peace that preaches forgiveness and love for the same enemies. However, the last reason, mixed with others that will be an heuristic expedient, more than any kind of easy reflection, military service remains inadvisable, not forbidden to the Christian, nor in particular does Tertullian specifically refer to the Mosaic tu non occides, as he would have done if he had believed that this was the main impediment to the militia for the faithful to Jesus. The fundamental fact on which he bases his anti-militarism is the danger that in the armed forces the Christian may compromise with idolatry with regard to the sacramentum and various other customs and military duties. But if service in the army is considered inadvisable and dangerous, the De Corona Tertullian goes much further. But if in the De Corona the service in the army is considered inadvisable and dangerous, Tertullian goes much further in the De Idolatria of 212, where he even judges it incompatible with the profession of Christian faith. And I quote, "We ask ourselves this: if a faithful can undergo military service, and if a soldier can be admitted to the faith, even if it is a simple soldier or a subordinate, whose presence at the sacrifices and death sentences is not mandatory. The divine sacramentum cannot be reconciled with the human sacramentum. The signum of Christ and that of the devil, the castra of light and those of darkness, and the same soul cannot serve two masters, God and Caesar. And how will he be able to fight indeed? How will he be able to perform military service, even in peace, without the sword that the Lord has taken from him? Even if the soldiers who went to John received a norm that allowed them to keep this office, even if the centurion had believed, this is the episode of Curtnaus when Jesus healed the centurion's slave, and the centurion believed that one. Later, the Lord, disarming Peter, this is what Tertullian says, disarmed all the soldiers. That's the passage where he identifies allegedly thing. With us, no function called to carry out illegal acts can be called lawful. So, all the most rigorous Tertullian anti-militarism revolves around this passage with radical clarity is indisputable. Naturally, it's very debatable because what is with Jesus actually disarming Peter in that specific circumstances? I mean, the Bible, here there's a very formalistic, evidence. I mean, it's the same Lord, so we can't try it lightly, but the concept is that Jesus here is essentially saving his own disciple, the one on which naturally the church will be founded, but he's doing it in the sense of a broader accomplishment of a divine intention, or a divine design that doesn't necessarily correspond to any kind of complete disarming of Christian society as a whole. However, this is fundamentally it. The harshly negative evaluation of the world is affirmed there without compromise. In echoing the gospel passage on the incompatibility between the service of God and that of Mammon, the place of the second was significantly taken by Caesar here. Right? And the contrast between God and Caesar was preceded by a parallel one between Christ and the devil, which establishes an immediate, though not explicit, this is still important, relationship between the emperor and the devil. So you understand what is happening here. He's identifying the elites of the pagan empire, still the pagan empire, as the Christians were fundamentally still, in the lower classes mostly, with the devil. Paralleling it, right? Not explicitly, because that would have been excessive and just from a Montanistic position, and also considering Tertullian's previous standpoint. However, all this one alone, right? These words alone are worth much more than a treatise, De Contemptu Mundi, altogether. I mean, it's a very extremistic view altogether. The theme of the Militia Christi is equally developed there too, if in speaking of Sacramenta Signia Castra, the symbological root remains of Pauline ancestry. Otherwise, that is the intention, right? Paul established a parallel between the two types of militia, and the very moment in which he indicated the specific weapons of the Christian one. Tertullian proposes them as not only different, but opposed and irreconcilable. We've seen in the video of Militia Christi how St. Paul fundamentally used all this literally lexicon from the Roman military vocabulary to stress what the Christian would have to become, literally in spiritual terms, right? Equating it to the same way a Roman legionnaire was equipped, trained, spirited, right? So that this was a very effective communicative strategy to spread the Christian message in the Roman Empire, right? It was fundamentally a militaristic power, and its subjects were fundamentally, logically agreeing with the situation. Also, pre-Roman realities were exactly the same. So, Tertullian does something different. He uses this divide, this naturally, spiritual and earthly dimension to stress the comparison between naturally God and the devil. So giving specifically a negative stigma to the latter, of course, but creating, as you understand, this is the point, a big divide between the two things. And consider what the standpoints had been. That fundamentally the Christians were actually fine with the empire, with the army, with the power of the emperor, and so on. Here the discriminant, as we will see, is fundamentally the Severian policy in the army that was now being felt, and proving also how many Christians there were in that sense in the broader Christian community. Because Christian soldiers were not a tiny elite, so that were just a minority. At least, there were lots of families, a lot of communities tied to the army in that sense. So Tertullian is expressing here, aside from his personal tendency towards Montanism at this point, and radical turn, we could say, also he's riding the wave of the Christian discontent towards the new military policies. Right? They're not anti-militaristic. They're specifically anti-Christian in the Roman army, which is a different thing. The Christians want to be there. They want to carry out the duty. Right? It's just that they're becoming compromised because of their fate, because of the formal recognition that fundamentally was all what the empire required. It's not that before Christianity there was any other religion there that fundamentally required something like faith. Faith was unknown in the pagan world. It was nothing like that. It was pure contractualism. There was no faith of sort. It was just, if I do this, the gods will give me that, and it was a plethora of them. Right? But this is widely renowned by any religious, historical standard. Right? The Romans didn't care whatever any person believed in, as long as it was not conceived as seditious, naturally, in broader terms, so much that the Roman Empire wasn't tolerant at all, actually, where entire cultures were wiped out with the accusation of witchery and so on, because they were objectively subversive in many ways. But specifically also they required this formalism, was typical of paganism, that is to say, you can't believe whatever the hell you want, as long as you sacrifice to the emperor and the empire, so the state. If you didn't do that, that was the real problem now. So there was properly a Roman policy that was going up and down at that level, and in this sense, it was going down. Also with the increasing of the autocratic character of the empire and so on. That's where things get rougher, because otherwise before, yes, there had been famously other bloody persecutions, think about the ones of Nero's times and so on, but those had actually also happened because of very serious problems that were going on in what was still fundamentally the Judeo-Christian society, because the split had not properly occurred, so there were actually serious problems of social order. But we'll have to talk about this in other situations. Here the thing is becoming more ideological, and also Christians are way more. So they have a say now that is impacting, and that sees them now in every aspects of society for which the empire actually takes measure against them, exactly for this reason, because they want to essentially regulate this is still essentially a minority, to prove the authority of the empire, to find a scapegoat in a way, or many other reasons are actually very, very complex altogether. They're not so simplistically expressible, but that's also what it is. However, and this is the important aspect, there are two elements that partially correct the sense of Tertullian appreciation of military service. The first is its limited meaning. The second, its context. So let's take a look at this. So the circumscribed meaning must be taken into account that the idolatria corresponds to a rigorous and extremist way of understanding the Christian message altogether. Right? This was a very important debate within Christian reality, because there was always an extremistic / rigoristic reality, especially pertaining to these Eastern contexts from which Christianity had also stemmed, but were influenced by other cultural realities, and a more, easygoing, more rational one, if you want, in the West, especially in Europe, in the certain parts, even on the Hellenic world, but especially in the Latin one, and that surely were influenced more by paganism, but they were also more properly, at that point, capable of producing an alternative, right? A compromise that, from a rigoristic perspective, surely wasn't acceptable, but there are no extremistic societies. Extremistic societies do not hold, right? You can have sects in a huge empire, but you can think they can remain as a minority, but in all societies, extremism is always limited because there can't be a functional reality that is extremistic, right? Think about the rigoristic ascetic thing. Everybody would have starved to death, because, or at least lived of subsistence, and the whole thing would have collapsed in terms of civilization. This is something never happened historically anywhere in human society, right? Which is another thing of having a different sensitivity and deciding to take another path and whatever. Naturally, there is also the biblical debate of whether, let's say, how the Bible should be interpreted. This is also another big topic, but generally speaking, it's, at least even still today, eminent Christian theologians actually say, you have to take things in a non-literalistic, not fundamentalistic meaning. There are big metaphors, deep meanings. Tertullian's interpretation of simply Jesus disarming Peter in the Gethsemane, well, that's too big to say. Altogether, there should be an all pacifistic society, no violence of sort. Do you think that's the message that the Bible is compelling? No, right? But it's deeper. And today, I repeat, we can't talk about this. But if you go into those videos, like the one of Saint Ambrose and the creation of a Roman Christian imperial consciousness, and the one on the Militia Christi, you will find a bit of that. So, and naturally, we'll come back on. So, as we were explaining, we know also that from other sources that the thought and practical action of most of Tertullian's co-religionists towards the army were not what he would have liked. And it is also clear from the same polemical accents with which ours accompanies his quotation of scriptures in the passage just mentioned. With the paradoxical rhetoric that is customary to Tertullian, in which always skillfully he never succeeds in fully convincing, he contrasts the soldiers who go to John and the centurion of Capernaum, Capharnaus, with the remitte gladium of Jesus to Peter in the Gethsemane. The polemical intent, not so much ad extra against the empire, but rather ad intra against the apologetic positions which considered military service lawful for the Christian, is clear. Right? The example of the dialogue between the soldiers and the Baptist, as well as that of the centurion of Capernaum, were, as we have seen, one of the most common Christian arguments for the militia. These were expressed very early in time, and they were naturally part of an extremistic take, an absolutistic take that is easy in a way to assume from, if you take a literal read of the Bible in that sense, and that therefore you can say this is the Word of God, but what about things like, it's a very formalistic, almost legalistic attitude, and we know that there is in the Christian message always a dual, to two parallel threads that run all together, in which there is a balance you have to take between the spiritual and the earthly that are directly connected, right? It does no specific good to pretend to enforce things that in the world cannot be enforced for human nature, because for the same Bible, universal sin cannot be, or there is no victory, there is no redemption if that was the case, and there can't be no salvation either, right? So this is actually pretty clear, but once again it pertains to the interpretations altogether. Looking at the De Idolatria content, so here the arch indictment, the arch anti-militaristic specific indictment does not figure as an end in itself. On the contrary, it is functionalized to the global struggle against idolatry. Principale crimen generis humani, summus seculi reatus. Right? Tertullian is far from preaching rebellion to the public authorities. He specifies without a shadow of ambiguity that the duty of Christians, as well as of any subject, is obedience to magistrates and princes. In short, to legitimate power, as long as this does not involve a compromise with idolatry. So this was actually a very old thing, right? Even in pre-Christian with Judaic, to be obedient to authorities, as long as they don't impose you something that is really intolerable in ways, which already entails a concept of tolerance, right? And not just to those specific, to broadly speaking, to a whole set of to the whole reality, if you want, by a certain degree of this society. So on this level, Tertullian's prohibition formulate on Christians to serve in the armed forces is not of a different quality from other prohibitions, which he also formulated against the most varied professions, for example. All in this or that way compromise with idolatry. For example, the sculptor and the seller of pagan sacred images, the soothsayer, the magician, the astrologer, and in fact were looked suspiciously upon also by Roman authorities. The school teacher, a profession that involves the story reading, albeit for a stylistic purpose, of the deeds of the gods, as it was at the time. So this is where naturally there is all the possible mistake which the Christian can incur. In other words, in the rigorous eschatological perspective of Tertullian Montanism, the Christian must not so much flee and reject military service, but rather flee and reject the world, right? In the profound irreconcilability between faith and the seculum, martyrdom remains the only solution proposed to the faithful in its relations with the life of the pagan state. So this is just as if the Christian state was simply hired. It says, it's a darker take, let's say, on the empire altogether, but Tertullian actually understands himself in this regard that there are lots of widespread risks, so he doesn't even take properly a formalistic or legalistic attitude in here. He simply says there are things we cannot tolerate, right? And here I tell you which one they are and why. And there is this divide, naturally, that exists unavoidably in Christianity between the spiritual and the earthly, but still they are connected, and that's the same reason why this prescription is fundamentally issued. So the Tertullian's extremism, in a way, is the heritage of an elite of ascetics that even when they met a contingent, broader consensus, right? And Tertullian's position could not be collected or shared by those who ask themselves the problem of any dialectical relationship between Christian communities and public powers. For them, the path to follow remained that of apologetics, and the very claim of a possible Christian right not to bear arms had to be conducted in terms of respect for the empire and collaboration with it. Origen set out for the arduous task with his Kata Kelson, written around 248 and aimed at refuting the arguments used 70 years earlier by Celsus to demonstrate the asociality and anti-civism of Christians. The post of the controversy was whether a Christian could be a good citizen or not. In the years in which the syncretistic experience of the Severian age was running out and new, more severe persecutions pressed on the horizon, the problem was fundamental for the survival of the Christian community. Origen's task, that is, to demonstrate the falsity of the Chalcedonian accusations regarding to the unavailability of Christians towards the state, was not light, nor did he know how to absolve it without uncertainties and contradictions. Thus, he could not remain silent that between the natural law, of which God is the author, and the written one used by the Roman state, there was a fundamental extraneousness for which the Christian could have compiled with the second only if and to the extent in which this had not been in contrast with the first. So the same standpoint, of course, of any Christian in that regard. On the other hand, Origen did not agree with the positions tending to see that the state as the exclusive action of evil forces, and therefore to resolve the relationship between it and Christians in apocalyptic terms. On the contrary, if anything, he leaned towards a providentialist conception of the empire, which he considered capable of guaranteeing peace and justice. Right? And this would set very important ground for further Christian, integration with the Roman Empire. Right? This is essentially the same base which in many ways Ambrose started from. Right? And this had actually been recognized already by other authors. Right? As we were saying before, the fact that the spiritual and earthly matters are separated, importantly, conceptually also, doesn't mean that these do not overlap in the human experience that is fundamentally about both. So there is a precedence to the spiritual one, but the earthly one also counts in that regard. And actually, what the Christian can do is to be seen, right? There are people who disagree, but at the time also. And nobody actually fully solved the question, but this is the kind of asymptotic message of Christianity in itself. That is, you can properly make a difference in the world relatively to spiritual matters as well with your action. So this doesn't, and this is actually the same essence of Christianity as Jesus' life itself proved. Right? It's not a purely spiritual journey. It's literally a human one as well. So it's both altogether. So it is, if this is Origen's judgment with respect to the empire, it follows that the collaboration of Christians with it is desirable, indeed precious, as long as it is made possible. As for military service, Origen does not cast any doubt on the necessity and justice of imperial wars, but limits himself to circumscribing the role of Christians on this level, which is particular. In fact, in a state like the Roman one, which sees fellow citizens of Christians and non-Christians, both groups will collaborate for the common good, right, all together, but each according to their own ethics, so that they will be the second to bear arms, actually. So even in here, there is still a divide, properly the exercise of arms and good Christian morals. But at the same time, they kind of contribute to the essence of an empire that is something earthly in practice, and secular as far as the Christian perspective is concerned, unless you take especially the providential nature of the empire and the ultimate goal of Christianization of the same, but the essence of it for people that lived in the 3rd century couldn't be but what the empire mostly was. There was a political and military power, and specific here we're talking about the imperium proper. So that's a very different meaning from our own. It's not a pure institutional form. It's something that has essentially to do with armies and wars and bloodshed, right? As for Christians, Origen underlines their radical peaceful nature too, right? Having changed swords into plowshares and spears into sickles, they no longer intend to carry arms or to make war or to kill. And here, consider we are in the mid-3rd century, so lots of things have changed also relatively to the participation of the general citizenship that now is turning to subjects in many ways on the empire. There are important changes in the same Roman army, ever more foreigners actually involved in it, and pagans at that level. So even this mindset should be read, given the context specifically, that of disarming of the population. Let's be honest about it. There was a specific process. I mean, in the first centuries of the empire, Italy, gradually the other provinces that had been Romanized had specifically a warlike character. These were all essentially tribal peoples from a few, up to a few time before, that were spent properly as military force also in this broader extension of the empire. Now, by the 3rd century, this thing all over the empire doesn't function anymore. There is no true participation to citizenship now through military service, for example, at least as a gluing force, because all subjects have become Roman citizens normally. But they're also becoming ever less powerful in their own regard from a political point of view. So, but for Origen states that at this point, therefore, Jesus is the only Christian leader. They will no longer take up arms, even if forced. So you understand that Origen even is, in certain ways, is even more anti-war, anti-military service, let's say better, than Tertullian for the Christians at a certain stage of his, thought, or Tertullian's thought, right? In fact, some may be surprised that the radical Tertullian, as it became in the later phase, had given to the tu non occides, so tu shall not kill, a marginal and irrelevant space in his anti-militaristic polemic, while the more conciliatory Origen made it almost the fulcrum of his argument. And this is actually logical, because of course the first was trying to go beyond the mere formal biblical in law, actually, of saying, in fact, you shall not kill, you must not kill. He had to bring other on the fore, while Origen had to start from also another standpoint, saying, yeah, that is wrong, but still we don't have to be radical about certain aspects of it, right? Precisely for this different choice of the argument, Tertullian proves to be radical and Origen conciliatory. In the first, which wrote in a moment of relative religious tolerance, the problem broke down at its root. Any collaboration with the state, if and to the extent that it presupposed a collaboration with idolatry specifically, had to be cut. The problem was idolatry. It wasn't much about the exercise of arms in itself. Probably he didn't even care that much. Tertullian is all about the problem of not yielding to idolatry. Not with bloodshed per se. He doesn't even state that. Right? That's the problem. And in the second, instead, in Origen, which instead operated in the perspective of strict persecutory prudence, did not want to show fundamental irreconcilability between Christianity and empire, which among other things would have been inconvenient as well as painful for the consciences of many Christians. Rather, that we were limited to asking for a kind of special status for the adepts of the new faith, such as to allow them to be at the same time good faithful and good citizens, without therefore raising the problem of the idolatrous acts imposed on the soldiers and involving their relationship with the state. An exemption from military service were requested for Christians. It was faith required keeping their hands clean from blood. If the pagans, Origen argues, recognized their priests the right to refrain from fighting, to be able to devote themselves uncontaminated to the divine mysteries, why can't the same thing, and for an identical reason, by the way, be granted to Christians? Abstention from war, however, does not mean either extraneousness to it, nor much less condemnation. If war is a natural fact, as bees and ants demonstrate, it was proven by Origen, also by modern ethology, right at this point. If it is common throughout the Old Testament, for example, if it is an integral part of life as well as a condition of security of that empire of which Christians are faithful and loyal citizens, if all this is true, Abstention from arms will be for those who obtain it a justifiable fact only in a priestly and ritual perspective, which will not exempt them from feeling involved and co-responsible in those wars themselves. That is not the point. It could have not even been by the time. The Christian, while refraining from killing, will pray to God for the victory of the emperor and for the triumph of his armies. And that will work. And people will die. Right? And this also entails all the vision also of what the empire is there for, in a providential sense. But that is yet something we will discuss in another moment. And in this, however, the Christian will be more useful in war than the bravest of soldiers, right? And here all the parallelisms with the Militia Christi are all naturally at a moral level. They were surely seen in many ways at that time, more clearly than today, I presume, as the real discriminant also as far as the war effort, let's say, was concerned, right? So I don't know whether it was clear or not, but fundamentally we have outlined how these positions actually start from not a refuse of war or an anti-militaristic standpoint. They have to do fundamentally with an important problem that pertains fundamentally to the relation of the Christian with the Roman state, right? And mostly with idolatry and the sin of killing, of course, but not with any anti-militaristic standpoint. Here, the matter discussed is not whether wars should be fought or not. That's not even the Christian's business in a way, right? Or better, it becomes that as far as the single Christian decides whatever he wants, but it shouldn't be a universal concern as long as Christians, especially at this time, are not in charge. Right, they're living fundamentally within the empire and doing stuff, but they still do not fundamentally identify with the state as such, as instead will start happening fundamentally from the 4th century onwards. And even in here, there would be many different takes. The Montanistic heresy is important in here because, as far as the Tertullian passage is concerned, as we've seen, it's fundamentally what the militaristic standpoint sounds like from, which is in reality connected, as we've seen, to the Severian military policy against Christian soldiers. There were soldiers such, so the problem is beyond that. But the Montanistic attitude of Tertullian altogether has to do actually as an anti-elite issue, right? It's the idea that the more you're compromised with the world in a way, and all these evil guys, it's a populistic stand, right? Tertullian was a bit of a conspiracy theorist at the end of the day, but he expressed at that point mostly also the view of a movement as Montanism was very peculiar in its own regard, as you know, it was this millenaristic movement that had, with Montanus had been expressed also, he would speak through the Holy Spirit. I mean, things that would naturally be defined as heretical in the 4th century, and that were very much anti-elite, right? Like it was, even here, right, in the era there was, for example, still kind of Celtic, mentality, spirituality in Asia Minor, Galatia, but there was this sense that after all, screw power, all this stuff. But I would like to see some connections with that as well. But in fact, it's something that led nowhere, because civilization takes definitely another and a higher path. And what it was an implicit criticism against the episcopal elites, which, telling the truth, weren't even that poor or not powerful in Asia Minor, but in fact, hypocrisy is a common language in many, everywhere, and in fact, it mostly typically comes from this extremistic standpoint, while it was being recognized, especially in the West, that this connection between the secular and spiritual hierarchies was actually the most important path for a Christian integration, for a Christian acceptation in the empire, inclusion in the empire. So this is also a way of, let's say, first of all, being aware that literature, politics is another thing. So even if Tertullian remains an important thinker and so on, it doesn't necessarily speak for the whole Christianity. That at this point it was doing something much more concrete and intelligent and practical and insightful, right? Looking at what the Roman reality really was about, to compromise with it, to negotiate, right? So these extremistic standpoints are going to lose. They always lose, historically speaking. This is the beauty of civilization, that at the end of the day, the majority understands what's better, or at least things go in a way that, is more moderate and functional at the same time, right? Unless something pretty damn serious doesn't happen in all this, which there's no determinism this either, but the norm is this one. So no, most definitely there is actually nothing anti-militaristic in this all, right? It's mostly, as we've seen, about the relation of Christians with the state. So this other thing, there can't be any Christian who is a militarist, as much as there can't be any Christian that is a pacifist, because these are two completely incongruent and actually pretty stupid ideas. Right, I rarely can think of something more stupid than things like pacifism or militarism in themselves. Right, there is nothing proud. I go as far as, probably it's not my business, but of course no Christian can be a pacifist by definition. And there is such actually a deep moral irresponsibility in pacifism that is unbelievable, to say the least. I mean, it's easily what can trigger actually even the rise of the most militaristic regimes, because inherently in it is leaving such an important business as violence in the hands of those who actually you're polarizing against you. It's completely responsible, it's letting the evil happening and not taking any measure. But also, more specifically, it's not functional to a society that works, right? And it's the symptom of a disease, of some sort of a malaise, of something that doesn't work in a reality if it takes over. But in any other case, as much as militarism, for that matter, that unfortunately is also the case. But whatever. Let's stop here with this. We'll talk about it another time. But for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.